Joining me in the studio today is Bar-Yoshafat, pro-Israel activist and author of I Flew to Speak About Israel, to discuss some of the current events around the world and their influence on Israeli PR. Thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, so you have spent quite a bit of time touring around United States campuses and speaking to the student body, etc. With pro-Israel advocacy and answering questions. What do you think is the overall image of Israel, held in these places?
Okay, so I think it's really important to understand that in America and in all of the world in general, most people don't wake up and say, hey, what's going on in Israel? Most people are either apathetic or actually pro-Israel. There are certain areas, certain cells, mainly on college campuses, where you can find groups that are super critical of Israel. You can find it mainly in the Pacific Northwest, the UCs, a little bit in the Midwest. And these are a very small target of people, but they have a lot of voice. You can hear them very often in these areas, and they have a strong impact.
So it changes, does it change dramatically from one campus to the next?
It does. Usually when the environment itself is a little bit more tilted to the progressive side, I would argue you will find people who are more anti-Israel.
Okay. Now, so then when you had some anti-Israel, advocates coming towards you and speaking, were they speaking from a position of knowledge, or were they speaking from a position of, they're parroting things that they may have heard?
Great question. So there are professors who are knowledgeable about Israel and the conflict. A lot of the Jewish community, which is unfortunately a big part of the anti-Israel campaign, are knowledgeable about Israel. But without a doubt, the vast majority are people who just memorize arguments against Israel, and they have no idea what's going on. And usually their arguments they're not connected to the reality that is happening here.
So, okay, do you think that the root of Israel's poor image problem lies with Israelis', lack of public relations, or, are their policies explained poorly? Are their policies indefensible? For example, Israel has, after they came out against, in the Six-Day War, and they retook the West Bank. It has been nearly 50 years since then, and there hasn't been a clear policy set forth for what is to be done with that area. So, that's how do you explain that to people?
Well, I would argue that the root of our problem is our existence. Meaning, when you see people chant, they chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. After '67, Israel actually had a huge support from all over the world. So I would doubt if it's because of the policy. If someone would go and protest because of Israel's policies in Judea and Samaria, I'd be like, okay, it's a little bit odd because I can think of 1 million better reasons, causes to fight for, but okay, I can accept that, but that's not what's happening. People are protesting against the bare existence of Israel. Now, it's okay to be critical of our policies, that's fine. I would argue if Israel will have a stronger policy, most of the world would actually appreciate it. Maybe not progressive world Jewry, but the vast majority of the world still uses terms of real politics, meaning you want to know where the country stands on and how it works. Israel became a hot topic much later after the Six-Day War. So I don't think it's about the Israeli policies. I would even go further to say most people don't really know about the policies that is happening in Israel. I would even say most college students wouldn't know where Israel is on a map.
All right, so moving on to a little bit more, positive things. The United States has passed, many different independent states, universities, etc., have passed anti-BDS legislation. Is this going far enough? Is the United States doing enough to aid in, kind of evening the playing field?
Well, first we need to understand what does it mean to have anti-BDS legislation. As a side note, I would say I really don't like the term BDS. I like to call them the movement to destroy Israel, because that is exactly what they're saying in their platform. But let's use their term just for this interview.
Okay.
You're allowed to boycott Israel. I cannot force someone not to boycott. If you're a vegetarian, you're boycotting beet product. That's fine. The thing is that you need to understand that if you're boycotting a country that's, I would say, the United States' #1 ally, or America is our #1 ally, then you're not working with your state, and that's not something positive. So you need to understand that the anti-BDS legislation would change the discourse, meaning people will understand that they're not jumping on the right bandwagon. They're just saying something that's not positive. They can still boycott Israel. They won't get tax benefits because they're working.
Right.
They're undermining their own government. So that's something very negative. So I would say that's the biggest impact of the anti-BDS legislation. I can also say that the BDS movements, the BDS activists are worried about that because they know that that's going to make it more harder for them to act.
So doesn't that fall back onto, educational platforms and kind of how the Middle East, and especially with respect to Israel, things are being taught and promoted? Because when you have all these people who are, anti-Israel, it more often than not comes from a position of, misinformation.
100%. The number one thing to do here is to educate people. It can be to educate Jews for their Jewish identity and tell them to come to Israel to learn and see for themselves. It can be for the non-Jewish community to come and explore Israel, and if they criticize Israel, maybe they should take a look and see what is happening here, not just from a YouTube video, but to actually come and see, and then you get a real broader picture. It can be sending Israelis to college campuses, which is happening a lot more today.
Okay.
You have different organizations. I'm a fan of Stand With Us because they send me for a long-term to be an emissary for Israel, and you go to one school and the other and you educate people about Israel. So there are many programs, and I think that without a doubt that is the best thing to do. It's also, by the way, not a new concept. That's how you change people's mind. You need to educate them so they'll have all of the information, and then they can shape out their mind and can be more pro, more anti, maybe, just critical, which is fine. I would argue more education, you'll become more pro-Israel.
So that actually brings me to my next question then. If, what groups, you mentioned Stand With Us. Other than that, how many groups are there? What groups would you advocate are really on the forefront of, pro-Israel advocacy?
Well, there's so many actually. I think it's a real growing phenomenon. Stand With Us are doing an excellent job at college campuses. I can take Shurat Adin, for example. It's an organization that sues terrorists that are hurting innocent civilians, be it Israeli civilians or American civilians, and they're trying to trace down the money and say you need to compensate because you murdered people. You have so many organizations on college campuses. I would even say every Jewish federation has like a Israel advocacy part where they try to put efforts into. And also within Israel, you have Ha'emet Sheli and Miluimnikim B'Chazit, and you have the person that came after me to Seattle, Chen Mezig, is doing pretty much the same thing that I did now also in Europe. It's growing. You also have non-Jews doing that, like the Forum to Draft the Christian Community in Israel. They're also flying abroad and saying, look, we're Christian Arabs and we're saying that Israel is a great place and what you're saying about Israel is just factually wrong. So it's really, really growing. A lot of people are becoming more active. I think mainly because it bothers you when people are bashing your country and they're not criticizing, they're bashing. They're not saying I disagree with this policy. They're saying, we don't want you to exist. They're chanting intifada, intifada, which means they want innocent civilians to be blown up. And whoa, we're not okay with that.
All right. Well, on that note, I would urge everybody listening to, to look up some of these advocacy groups and become involved. And thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right.